Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this is it. It's the final chapter, the last week actually before finals. And so it's chapter 14 of our online text, and it's named Why I Spent at Least $20,000 on Apple products. And as I was writing this, I realized that that's probably not right. I've probably spent far more than $20,000 in my lifetime with Apple in the past, I don't know, 12, 15 years. I've probably had, every iMac. So I've probably had 4 or 5 iMacs, and I've probably had 4 or 5 laptops, and Apple phones, and iPads, and iPods, and Apple Watch, and all the content that I've bought. So I don't know that that chapter title of spending at least $20,000 is accurate. It's probably more than that. But I wanted to finish this course with Steve Jobs and Apple Computer because I think they wrap up, or the story wraps up, a lot of themes that we've studied throughout the semester. So I think it's a good way to end it. So when I talk about Apple Computer and Steve Jobs, I personally kind of talk about them interchangeably. So yes, I know I'm talking about an individual, but I'm also talking about the company. And for those of you who don't know the story of Apple and who Steve Jobs is, you're going to watch a video in this unit. But really quickly, Steve Jobs was really the idea guy, the innovator behind Apple Computer, and he co-founded it with Steve Wozniak, who was really the engineer and the coder and also the electronic engineer putting the machines together. So Steve Jobs is really known for his design and his innovation, and also harsh management style, because he knew what he wanted, and he demanded the best of his people. There's a great story actually that my son shared with me just the past weekend when I was visiting him about Steve Jobs and the first iPod. And the engineers invented a prototype of the first iPod. This is going back like 10 years ago. And Steve Jobs looked at it and he wasn't really impressed because design was important to him. And it wasn't as small as he thought it could be. So the engineers gave him this iPod, and he looked at it and he threw it into an aquarium that was in the same room. And after he saw air bubbles coming up out of the iPod, he looked at his engineers and he said, "See, there's more room in there. You can make it smaller." So that's the way he was. When he wanted something done a certain way, he would get it done. And so I think it's important as an innovator to think of Steve Jobs. And I think when we're starting to tie Apple and Steve Jobs in with these themes that we've had over the semester, certainly this first theme of capitalism, Steve Jobs is the kind of guy who thrives under capitalism because he can be as innovative as he wants. He can do whatever he wants with his company without really worrying about the government dictating to him what he should be producing. So if you remember, I think week 2 of the course, there was an article by a historian named Carl Degler, Capitalism Came on the First Ships. So just kind of keep that theme in mind, because I think Apple really exemplifies capitalism and what it is. Some other themes we talked about early on in the class, certainly week 3 or week 4, we talked about intellectual property, which was patent law, right? And we talked about how that was codified into the Constitution, and it was the intent of the founders to establish some sort of protection of intellectual property to serve as motivation to innovate. And certainly Apple Computer is a poster child when it comes to innovation, and also when it comes to how many patents they hold. So, without the patent system, people could copy iPhones and iWatches, and Apple would no longer be able to fund their own innovations. So intellectual property is important. We talked about that early in the class, and Steve Jobs and Apple Computer certainly are another good example of how intellectual property can be used to a company's advantage. Beyond that, we talked about these themes of infrastructure. So we talked about communications, and that started with Samuel Morse and the telegraph, and we went all the way up to the internet. So certainly we know the importance of the internet to a company like Apple Computer, so there's a nice tie-in there as well. Also, we talked about infrastructures of energy, so we talked about electricity. Obviously, the entire digital era is dependent upon electricity, so that's important, and it's a nice tie-in. Another one is marketing. So a few weeks ago, we talked about the ascendancy of Madison Avenue and really the science of marketing and persuasion, and perhaps No company does that better than Apple. You'll have an opportunity in this week to look at 3 or 4 different Apple ads, and if you haven't seen them before, you'll see just how innovative they are at creating an image which makes people like me want to buy their products. So we studied marketing, good tie-in there. Another great tie-in is creative destruction. So that was 3 or 4 weeks ago, and if you remember, creative destruction referred to this concept that under capitalism, people tend to innovate and obsolete others. And if you look at Apple, again, it couldn't be a better example of creative destruction, because with the introduction of the iPhone in 2006, really Apple obsoleted any other phone, any other cell phone, and created this whole new category of smartphones. So that's creative destruction. Think about the Apple Watch. You may or may not like your Apple Watch. You may not have an Apple Watch, but all of a sudden, Apple is the largest seller of watches in the world in the past, 4 years? So there's a lot of creative destruction there, not to mention streaming music and iTunes. Again, iTunes wasn't first to streaming music, but really they were the most adopted. And when it comes down to obsoleting and creative destruction, they really changed the entire nature of the music distribution business with iTunes, and went to a subscription streaming service, and really obsoleted record stores and changed the way that music is distributed. So again, with creative destruction, not a better example than Apple. Also, the other theme we talked about, I think it was last week, we talked about Robert Noyce, and we talked about the invention of the integrated circuit. And that was kind of cool, because you read an article about when Steve Jobs met Noyce, and so there's a nice tie-in between like the 50s and 60s, the young electronics industry, all the way up to the digital era, with that intersection between Noyce and Steve Jobs. So again, I think that Steve Jobs and Apple kind of bring the course full circle. So I want you to read through the chapter. There's some great advertisements that are fun, and you can learn a lot about Apple. And I just want to leave you with this one thing. So one of the things you'll be doing this week is you'll be looking at a Steve Jobs quote, and it's like a 3-minute video. And the quote starts that everything in this world was created by people no smarter than you. And this is a real famous Steve Jobs quote, and it's longer, it's 3 or 4 sentences, but I think this first sentence, that everything in the world was created by people no smarter than you, is very inspiring, and I want to leave you with this, because if you get nothing else out of this class, I want you to think about all of the people that we've learned about, and all of the innovations, and how most of these came about when someone had an idea and they were inspired to move forward and they were inspired to innovate. So I hope that's something that you've taken away from this class. You've seen how history can serve as a platform for inspiration and innovation, and I want you all to be successful in whatever endeavors you undertake. So that's it for the course. I hope you had a good semester. I hope you have a great spring semester, and be safe. Take care now. Bye-bye.